The morning sun streamed through the massive glass windows of London Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5, casting long shadows across the polished floor. It was just another busy Monday morning, with travelers rushing about, pulling their wheeled luggage and checking departure boards. But for one passenger, this ordinary morning would soon become extraordinary. The owner of Thompson Global Aviation Holdings stood quietly in the premium check-in line of Gateway Airlines, observing the bustling scene around him. He'd deliberately chosen to fly incognito on one of his recently acquired airlines, wearing a simple navy blazer and carrying a weathered leather briefcase, a favorite from his early business days. While his net worth exceeded billions, he preferred staying low-key, often traveling without the usual entourage that accompanied most corporate executives. The business-class check-in area buzzed with activity. Men and women in crisp suits chatted on phones, typed on laptops, or scrolled through tablets. Flight crews in neat uniforms wheeled their bags efficiently through the terminal, and the gentle hum of conversations in various languages filled the air. He watched as other passengers moved smoothly through the check-in process. A group of executives in front of him were processed quickly, receiving warm smiles and efficient service. The check-in staff seemed to practically trip over themselves to assist them, offering extra assistance with lounge access and seat preferences. When his turn came, he stepped forward with a polite smile, placing his passport and business-class ticket on the counter. The check-in attendant's welcoming expression subtly shifted as she looked up from her computer screen. Her eyes darted between his face and his documentation, her previously warm demeanor cooling noticeably. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, well-dressed in his tailored suit that spoke of quiet luxury rather than flashy brands. Years of experience in the corporate world had taught him the value of understated elegance. The attendant picked up his business-class ticket with perfectly manicured fingers, examining it as if it were written in hieroglyphics. She turned it over, held it up to the light, and frowned slightly. "There seems to be some irregularity with your ticket, sir," she said, her tone carrying a hint of doubt that hadn't been present with previous passengers. Behind him, more travelers were being directed to other counters, smoothly proceeding with their check-ins while he stood there, watching the attendant scrutinize his perfectly valid documentation. He maintained his composed demeanor, though he couldn't help but notice how other business-class passengers were flowing through the process without a second glance. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just yesterday, he'd been in a board meeting discussing Gateway Airlines' customer service metrics and their plans for improvement. Now he was experiencing firsthand exactly what needed to change. A few feet away, a family was being enthusiastically welcomed to the premium check-in desk, their business-class tickets barely glanced at before being processed. The contrast was striking, but not surprising to him. After decades in the business world, such moments had become familiar, though no less disappointing. He checked his watch, a subtle timepiece that cost more than most cars, and waited patiently as the attendant continued her unnecessary investigation. He could have easily mentioned his position, pulled out his phone, and made a single call that would have the entire terminal management scrambling to attention. But that wasn't his style, and more importantly, it would defeat the purpose of his incognito travel. The attendant's fingers clacked against her keyboard, her frown deepening as she apparently found nothing to justify her suspicions. Still, rather than proceeding with check-in, she reached for her phone, clearly preparing to escalate the situation. The owner of the airline stood quietly, his expression neutral but observant, mentally noting every detail of the interaction. Little did the staff know that this moment would soon become a turning point for their airline, one that would be discussed in corporate training sessions and business schools for years to come. But for now, he simply waited, watching as unconscious bias played out before him in the bright morning light of one of the world's busiest airports. The check-in attendant held the phone to her ear, speaking in hushed tones while occasionally glancing up at the airline's owner. Around them, the morning rush continued, business travelers streaming past with their carry-ons and briefcases, none paying attention to the quiet drama unfolding at the premium counter. "I'll need to verify this booking with my supervisor," she announced, her voice carrying that special tone of authority that customer service representatives sometimes use when they've already made up their minds about something. "There seems to be an unusual pattern with this ticket." The airline owner raised an eyebrow slightly. "Unusual pattern?" he asked calmly, his voice level and controlled. Could you explain what you mean by that? The attendant shifted uncomfortably, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. Well, you see, sometimes we get. She paused, searching for words. Unusual bookings in business class. We need to be very careful about maintaining our standards. Just then, another passenger approached the adjacent counter. An older gentleman in a golf shirt and khakis, carrying a business class ticket similar to the owner's. The second attendant processed his check-in immediately, not even bothering to verify his ID against his credit card. I see, the owner replied, watching this scene unfold. And what standards would those be exactly? Before the attendant could respond, her supervisor appeared, walking briskly toward the counter. He was dressed in a crisp uniform with a shiny name badge, projecting an air of authority that seemed slightly forced. "Good morning, sir," the supervisor said, though his tone suggested it wasn't a particularly good morning at all. "I understand there's some confusion about your booking." The owner remained perfectly composed, though he noticed how the supervisor's eyes skipped over his expensive watch and well-tailored suit, focusing instead on his face with poorly concealed skepticism. "There's no confusion on my end," he replied quietly. "I have a valid business class ticket, purchased through your website, along with my passport and frequent flyer information. I'm curious to know what specific concerns you have." The supervisor cleared his throat, shuffling through the documents again. "Well, you see, sir, business class is a premium service," he began, his voice taking on that particular condescending tone that made the words "sir" sound more like an insult than a courtesy. "I'm well aware of what business class is," the owner responded, his voice remaining steady but carrying just a hint of steel beneath its surface. "I've flown it quite frequently." Around them, other passengers were starting to notice the exchange. A few slowed their pace, watching with mixed expressions of curiosity and discomfort. The owner could see recognition dawning on some faces, not of who he was, but of what was happening. The supervisor leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy. We have some excellent seats available." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with implication. The owner took a slow, deliberate breath, thinking about all the times he'd faced similar situations before becoming successful, about all the people who still faced them every day. "More comfortable," he repeated, letting the words sit there for a moment. "Could you explain why you think I'd be more comfortable there?" The supervisor's face flushed slightly. "Sir, we're simply trying to ensure that all our passengers are properly allocated." "Properly allocated," the owner echoed, noting how the supervisor's discomfort grew with each passing moment. "And how exactly do you determine proper allocation?" A small crowd had gathered now, trying to appear like they weren't watching while very much watching. The morning sun had risen higher, streaming through the terminal windows and illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. The owner reached into his jacket pocket, and both the attendant and supervisor tensed slightly. An unconscious reaction that spoke volumes. He slowly withdrew his phone, its screen reflecting the overhead lights. "Before we continue this discussion about proper allocation," he said, his thumb hovering over the screen, "perhaps we should call the airline's corporate office. I'm sure they'd be very interested in understanding exactly how these allocation decisions are being made." The supervisor's professional mask slipped slightly, showing a flash of uncertainty. Something in the owner's tone, or perhaps his unwavering confidence, finally sparked a hint of doubt in the supervisor's mind. Behind them, the regular business of the airport continued. Announcements echoed through the terminal, planes could be heard taking off in the distance, and travelers rushed to their gates. But at this premium check-in counter, time seemed to have slowed to a crawl as years of institutional bias collided with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced it all before and now had the power to do something about it. The tension at the premium check-in counter had reached a breaking point. Other passengers now openly watched the scene unfold, some recording discreetly with their phones, others whispering among themselves. The morning light streaming through the terminal's glass ceiling seemed to spotlight the confrontation like a stage drama. "Sir," the supervisor began again, his voice strained with forced politeness. "I'm simply trying to explain our premium cabin policies." He gestured vaguely at a laminated sheet of rules that everyone knew didn't actually address the real issue at hand. The airline's owner glanced at his watch again, noting that 15 minutes had passed since this ordeal began. In that time, he'd watched at least 8 other business class passengers breeze through check-in without a single question about their allocation. These policies, the owner said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make both staff members lean in slightly. Could you show me exactly where they're written? I'd be very interested in reading them. The supervisor shifted his weight uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. The morning was getting warmer, or perhaps it was just the heat of the situation. Well, you see, it's more about our standard procedures. Standard procedures, the owner repeated thoughtfully. And do these procedures include holding some passengers at the counter while others walk right through? A young woman in the growing crowd of onlookers nodded in agreement, catching the owner's eye. She gave him a small smile of understanding. Clearly, she'd been through similar experiences herself. The check-in attendant, now visibly nervous, began rapidly typing on her computer. "Sir, perhaps if you could show us additional identification, or maybe a letter from your company." The owner reached into his briefcase, movements deliberately slow and calm. He could feel the supervisor's eyes tracking his every move, that ingrained suspicion still evident despite the expensive leather of the briefcase and the precise cut of his suit. "You know," the owner said conversationally as he withdrew another form of ID, "I fly about 200,000 miles a year. Sometimes in first class, sometimes in business, occasionally in economy when other cabins are full. And it's fascinating how the experience can be so different depending on who's working the counter." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. A few heads in the crowd nodded knowingly. An elderly gentleman in the back actually said, "Mung," loud enough for others to hear. The supervisor's professional mask cracked slightly. "Sir, I assure you we treat all our premium passengers equally. Do you?" The owner interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Because in the past 20 minutes, I've watched multiple passengers check in without being asked for additional identification or questioned about their allocation. Would you like to explain that?" The gathered crowd had grown larger now, and the murmuring had increased. Some people had their phones out, though whether they were recording or messaging about the incident wasn't clear. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge between a quiet resolution and becoming the kind of viral moment no airline wants to see on social media. The supervisor glanced nervously at the growing crowd, then at his computer screen, then back at the owner. "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private," he suggested, finally sensing that this situation was spiraling beyond his control. "I think right here is perfect," the owner replied calmly. "After all, these are your standard procedures, aren't they? Nothing to hide." A woman in a business suit standing nearby actually chuckled at that, quickly covering it with a cough when the supervisor glanced her way. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the terminal was getting busier. More passengers were arriving for their flights, many slowing down to observe the scene. The owner remained perfectly still, a study in patience and composure, while the staff members fidgeted and exchanged worried glances. Just then, the click of quick footsteps echoed across the terminal floor. Someone was approaching rapidly from the direction of the airline's offices, someone wearing a badge that indicated senior management. The owner allowed himself a small smile. It seemed the situation was about to take an interesting turn. The supervisor and check-in attendant hadn't noticed the approaching figure yet, too busy conferring in hushed whispers about what to do next. The owner could have ended this situation at any time by revealing his identity, but he knew this moment needed to play out. Some lessons could only be learned through experience, and this was about to become a very educational morning for everyone involved. The clicking of heels against the terminal floor grew louder, and the regional director of Gateway Airlines emerged from the crowd. She was carrying a tablet and walking with the purposeful stride of someone who had just received some very interesting news from corporate headquarters. The moment she spotted the owner standing at the check-in counter, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her tablet nearly slipped from her fingers, and the color drained from her face. The supervisor, still unaware of her presence, continued his awkward explanation about company policies. "I can assure you, sir," he was saying, "that we have very specific guidelines about." "About what?" The regional director's voice cut through the air like a knife, causing both the supervisor and check-in attendant to spin around. The gathered crowd parted slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The owner remained quiet, watching as recognition dawned in the regional director's eyes. She had met him 3 months ago during the company acquisition, sitting across the table during final negotiations. Now she was seeing him in a completely different context, and the implications were hitting her like a tidal wave. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Sir, I had no idea you were flying with us today." She turned to the supervisor and check-in attendant, who were looking between her and the owner with growing confusion. "Do you have any idea who this is?" The supervisor straightened his tie nervously. "Ma'am, we were just explaining our business class policies to this gentleman." Even now, he couldn't quite keep the doubt out of his voice. The regional director closed her eyes for a moment, as if praying for strength. When she opened them, her voice was surprisingly calm. "This gentleman," she said slowly, "is the owner of Gateway Airlines. He acquired our company 3 months ago." The effect of her words was immediate and electric. The supervisor's mouth fell open, the check-in attendant grabbed the counter for support, and a collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Someone in the back whispered, "No way," loud enough for everyone to hear. The owner watched as the realization spread across their faces like a sunrise, slow at first, then all at once. The supervisor's earlier condescension melted away, replaced by a look of pure horror. The check-in attendant's hands began to shake slightly as she looked down at the business class ticket she had been so suspicious of just moments ago. "Sir, the supervisor started, but words seemed to fail him. His face had gone from flushed to pale, then back to flushed again. The regional director stepped forward, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. "Sir, I cannot begin to apologize enough for this situation, if you'll allow me to." The owner held up a hand, silencing her. The terminal had grown oddly quiet, as if everyone in the vicinity was holding their breath. Even the usual airport announcements seemed muted. "Before anyone says anything else," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed terminal, "I want to make something very clear. I'm not angry because of who I am. I'm concerned because of who I wasn't." He looked around at the gathered crowd, making eye contact with several observers who nodded in understanding. "If I had been just another passenger, a teacher, a doctor, a business person who saved up for a premium ticket, would this treatment have been acceptable?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The supervisor stared at his shoes, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The check-in attendant had tears forming in the corners of her eyes, whether from embarrassment or genuine realization, it wasn't clear. "Ma'am," the owner addressed the regional director, who straightened automatically at his words. "I think we need to have a conversation about customer service training. Not just here, but across the entire airline." She nodded quickly, already pulling up notes on her tablet. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Would you like to?" "But first," he interrupted gently, "I would like to board my flight. I believe my seat allocation has been sorted out." He raised an eyebrow at the supervisor, who nearly tripped over himself reaching for the boarding pass printer. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people gave the owner appreciative nods or small smiles of respect. He had handled the situation with dignity and turned it into a teaching moment rather than a punishment, though everyone knew there would be significant changes coming to Gateway Airlines very soon. The aftermath of the revelation rippled through Terminal 5 like waves in a pond. The check-in counter area had transformed from a scene of confrontation to one of awkward aftermath, with staff members looking like they'd rather disappear into the floor tiles beneath their feet. The regional director was now on her phone, speaking quietly but intensely to what seemed to be other executives. Her free hand moved rapidly across her tablet, likely documenting the morning's events. Every few seconds, she would glance at the owner with a mix of respect and anxiety. The supervisor stood nearby, his earlier confidence deflated like a balloon. His hands kept fidgeting with his name badge, and he seemed to be struggling with what to do with himself. The check-in attendant had busied herself with paperwork, though her trembling hands made it clear she wasn't actually reading any of it. "Sir," the regional director said, covering her phone's microphone, "the board is gathering for an emergency meeting. They'd like to know if you'll be joining them virtually before your flight." The owner shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, his voice carrying that same calm authority it had maintained throughout the entire incident. "I think it's more important that I fly today, as planned. Let's see how our actual service matches up with what we promise in those board meetings. A few passengers who were still lingering nearby exchanged knowing looks. One businessman actually pulled out his phone and appeared to be canceling his own upcoming flight booking, perhaps thinking twice about supporting an airline with such practices. The owner turned to address the staff directly. They all straightened up automatically, like students when a teacher enters the classroom. "I'd like you all to continue your shifts today," he said, surprising everyone. "But I want you to think about something while you work." He paused, making sure he had their complete attention. Think about every passenger who comes to your counter. Think about how many times this might have happened before. Think about the people who didn't have the power to make you listen. The check-in attendant wiped a tear from her cheek, nodding slowly. The supervisor swallowed hard, his face showing the first real signs of genuine understanding rather than just embarrassment. Just then, a young family approached the counter next to them. A mother and father with 2 small children, all dressed nicely but not expensively. They were clutching business class tickets and looking nervous, as if they'd saved up for this special journey. The owner nodded toward them meaningfully. The supervisor caught his glance and quickly moved to assist them, this time with genuine warmth and respect in his voice. The transformation was subtle but significant. The regional director was still making calls, but now she was talking about immediate training sessions and policy reviews. Words like comprehensive overhaul and cultural transformation could be heard in her rapid-fire conversations. A young maintenance worker who had been watching the scene unfold approached the owner cautiously. "Sir," he said quietly, "thank you. My mother, she experienced something similar last month. Nobody listened to her complaints." The owner turned to the regional director. "I want this gentleman's mother's complaint file on my desk tomorrow morning," he said firmly. She nodded, already typing a note. More staff members began gathering around, drawn by the whispered conversations spreading through the terminal. The owner noticed how they watched him, not with the fearful respect typically given to a boss, but with something closer to admiration for how he had handled the situation. "You know," he said, addressing the growing group of airline employees, "company policies are important. Standards are important. But do you know what's more important?" He paused, looking each person in the eye. "Humanity, dignity, respect. These aren't just words for a training manual. They're the foundation of everything we do." The staff members nodded, many taking out notepads or phones to write down his words. This wasn't just damage control anymore, it was becoming a moment of genuine change. The regional director finished her calls and approached with the owner's boarding pass, now properly printed and validated. "Sir, your flight is ready for boarding," she said, then added more quietly, "And sir, thank you for handling this the way you did. We needed this wake-up call." As he took the boarding pass, he smiled for the first time that morning, not a smile of triumph or satisfaction, but one of hope for real change. "Sometimes," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "the most important lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments." The terminal was fully awake now, buzzing with the usual morning rush, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. As the owner walked toward the security checkpoint, he could hear snippets of conversation behind him, staff members already discussing changes they wanted to make, sharing stories they'd been afraid to tell before, and making plans for a better tomorrow. Later that afternoon, in one of the airport's private conference rooms, something unprecedented was happening. The owner had decided to delay his flight by a few hours, recognizing that this moment was too important to waste. The room was packed with airline staff, not just the check-in counter employees, but ground crew, gate agents, flight attendants, and even some pilots who were between flights. The atmosphere was different now. Gone was the morning's tension, replaced by something more constructive. The owner stood at the front of the room, his jacket off, sleeves rolled up. A clear signal that this was about real work, not just corporate talk. "Let's be honest with each other," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What happened this morning wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about Gateway Airlines. It's about something much bigger." People nodded, some taking notes, others just listening intently. A flight attendant raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice slightly shaky but determined, "I've seen similar things happen on flights. Sometimes crew members make assumptions about which passengers belong in which cabins." I'd wanted to say something, but you weren't sure if anyone would listen, the owner finished for her. She nodded, relieved that someone understood. A gate agent spoke up next. Last week, I had a passenger, a neurosurgeon, who got the same treatment at the priority boarding line. By the time we realized our mistake, the damage was already done. More stories started flowing. It was as if a dam had broken, with staff members finally feeling safe enough to share experiences they'd witnessed, or in some cases, been part of. The owner listened to each story, occasionally asking questions, but mostly letting people speak their truth. The regional director, who had been typing frantically on her laptop, looked up. "Sir, we're already drafting new training protocols. But maybe we're approaching this wrong. Maybe we need to hear from the people in this room first." The owner smiled. "Exactly," he said, walking over to the whiteboard. "Let's build this together. Real change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from everyone in this room." For the next 2 hours, they worked together. The custodian's suggestion about body language awareness was just as valued as the pilot's input about crew briefing procedures. A baggage handler shared a story about passenger assumptions that led to a complete rethinking of the luggage handling protocol. The check-in attendant from the morning's incident, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "I keep thinking about how many times I might have done this without realizing it," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "We need more than just training. We need to change how we think." The owner nodded encouragingly. "That's the most important step, recognizing that we all have biases. The question is, what do we do about them?" A young gate agent raised his hand. "What if we had regular feedback sessions, not just from passengers, but from staff too? Like, if we see something wrong, we should be able to say it without fear." The idea sparked a wave of suggestions. Soon, the whiteboard was filled with proposals: blind customer service audits, community engagement programs, partnership with diversity consultants, regular staff workshops, and most importantly, a complete overhaul of the company's approach to customer interaction. The supervisor who had been part of the morning's incident raised his hand. "Sir, I've been in this industry for 15 years, and I've never been in a meeting like this. Usually when something goes wrong, it's all about damage control and moving on. But this feels different." The owner looked around the room, taking in the engaged faces, the open notebooks, the honest discussions happening in every corner. "That's because this isn't about damage control," he said. "This is about making real change, and real change isn't comfortable. It's not quick, but it's necessary." Someone from the back of the room spoke up. "Will other airlines think we're crazy? Spending all this time and money on something that most companies just sweep under the rug?" The owner's response was immediate. "Let them think what they want. We're not doing this for other airlines. We're doing this because it's right. Because every person who books a ticket with us deserves to be treated with respect, dignity, and humanity." As the meeting continued, plans were made, committees were formed, and real, actionable steps were outlined. But more importantly, something had shifted in the room. People weren't just nodding along to please the boss. They were actively engaging, sharing, learning, and committing to change. The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows through the conference room windows when the owner finally looked at his watch. He had missed his original flight, but somehow that seemed like a small price to pay for what had been accomplished in this room. 6 months had passed since that transformative morning at Heathrow Airport. The terminal looked the same. Sunlight still streamed through the massive windows, passengers still hurried to their gates, and planes still took off and landed with clockwork precision. But something fundamental had changed. At the premium check-in counter, a new system was in place. Staff members worked in diverse pairs, supporting and learning from each other. The same check-in attendant who had questioned the owner's ticket that morning was now conducting training sessions herself, sharing her experience with new employees. "It's not just about following rules," she explained to a group of trainees, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned from experience. "It's about seeing the person in front of you, really seeing them." The supervisor had become an unexpected champion for change. Today, he was helping an elderly couple navigate the check-in process, showing the kind of patience and respect that had been missing from his behavior 6 months ago. When a young professional approached with a business class ticket, the supervisor's welcoming smile was genuine and equal. In the staff break room, a wall had been transformed into what employees called the Growth Gallery. It displayed letters from passengers sharing their experiences, both positive and negative, and how the airline had responded. Rather than hiding complaints, they were used as learning opportunities. The regional director was in a meeting with executives from other airlines who had noticed the changes at Gateway. "Our customer satisfaction scores have increased by 40%, she explained, showing them the data. But more importantly, our staff morale has never been higher." A young maintenance worker, the same one whose mother had faced discrimination, was now part of the airline's newly formed Customer Experience Committee. "My mom flew business class last week," he told his colleagues during a meeting. She said she finally felt like she belonged there. In the main terminal, a large screen displayed the airline's new commitment to passengers. Every journey matters, every passenger counts. But unlike typical corporate slogans, this one had real weight behind it. Every staff member had contributed to its meaning. The owner still flew incognito occasionally, testing his own airline service. But now he noticed different things. How the ground crew helped an elderly passenger with her bags without being asked, how the check-in staff made eye contact and smiled genuinely at every customer, how the flight attendants treated everyone with equal respect regardless of their seat assignment. One morning, he overheard a conversation between two passengers waiting at the gate. "You know," one said to the other, "I used to hate flying with Gateway. Always felt like they were judging me. But something's different now. Can't quite put my finger on it." The other passenger nodded. "I read about what happened here 6 months ago. That owner who got profiled at check-in, instead of firing everyone, he used it to change the whole company. Pretty amazing when you think about it." In the airport's training center, new employees watched a video about that morning's events. But it wasn't just about what went wrong. It was about how the airline had transformed itself. The check-in attendant and supervisor from that day appeared in the video, sharing their perspectives with raw honesty. "We thought we were just following procedures," the supervisor explained on screen. "But we were following our biases instead. Learning to see that difference, that's what changed everything." The owner had kept his promise about the maintenance worker's mother's complaint. Not only had it been addressed, but her experience had helped shape the airline's new training programs. Her story, along with others, became part of the company's DNA. Other airlines had indeed noticed the changes. Some laughed it off as a publicity stunt, but others saw the results. Higher customer satisfaction, better staff retention, and a growing reputation for genuine, respectful service. Slowly but surely, Gateway was setting a new standard for the industry. The check-in counter where it all began now had a small plaque, easily missed unless you knew to look for it. It didn't mention names or specific events. It simply read, "Every story matters. Every person counts. Change begins here." As the sun set on another busy day at the airport, a group of trainees gathered around their instructor, the same check-in attendant from that fateful morning. One of them asked her why she stayed with the airline after such an embarrassing incident. She smiled, looking out at the busy terminal. "Because this isn't just about checking tickets anymore," she said. "It's about being part of something bigger, something real, something that matters." And as if to prove her point, at that very moment, a diverse stream of passengers approached the counter, each one greeted with the same genuine smile, the same respectful service, the same human dignity that should have been there all along. The change wasn't just in the procedures or the training. It was in the hearts and minds of every person who wore the Gateway Airlines uniform. The story of that morning had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had become a blueprint for transformation, a reminder that real change is possible, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most humbling moments.